Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten Weld. I'm a professor of Latin American history here at Harvard, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Hasta Encontrarles, the Caravan of Mothers of Missing Migrants and the Root Causes of Migration. For the past 17 years, the Caravan of Mothers of Missing Migrants has traveled across Mexico, searching for their loved ones who disappeared while attempting to migrate to the United States and demanding concrete changes in migration policy. This fall, for the first time, 4 mothers have continued their pilgrimage all the way into the United States, and 2 of them, Ángela Lacayo and Araceli Ramirez de Mejia, are here with us today. They'll engage in conversation with scholars Suyapa, Portillo, Villeda, and Jorge Cuéllar to discuss the criminalization of migration, the root causes of displacement, and their ongoing efforts to locate the disappeared. First, let me introduce the mothers and say that it is a real honor to have you here with us today. Ángela Lacayo is from Honduras. Her eldest son disappeared in 2016 in Piedras Negras, Coahuila, right before crossing the border. He called to tell her that he had hired a coyote and was ready to cross, and then she never heard from him again. Ángela is part of a committee of mothers in Tegucigalpa who meet regularly to host events, support each other, and raise awareness about migration and violence. Araceli Ramirez de Mejia is from El Salvador. She is part of a group of mothers of disappeared people called COFAMIDE, which has a membership of about 300 people. She's been active with COFAMIDE for 8 years since her eldest son went missing at the Texas border. She's now part of the group's leadership. We're also privileged to have with us today Suyapa, Portillo, Villeda, and Jorge Cuéllar, 2 top scholars of Central America. Dr. Portillo Villeda is Associate Professor of Chicano, Chicana, and Latino, Latina Transnational Studies at Pitzer College. She's a historian of social movements, marginalized identities, and working class life, and she is the author of Roots of Resistance, a story of gender, race, and labor on the north coast of Honduras. Dr. Cuéllar is Assistant Professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies at Dartmouth College, where he researches and teaches on the politics and culture of contemporary Central America. His current book project, Everyday Life and Everyday Death in El Salvador, examines Salvadorans' strategies for making life and building community amid marginality, structural abandonment, and quotidian violence. A couple of logistical items I need to mention before we start. First, to hear either the English or the Spanish interpreter for this event, just click on the interpretation icon, just shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen, and select the language that you would like to hear. If you'd like to hear the interpreted language only, you can click mute original audio. Basically, I, Jorge, and Suyapa will be speaking in English, and the mothers will be speaking in Spanish. So that's how this is going to work. Secondly, at any point during this event, you can submit questions to any of our speakers, and we encourage you to do so. We will try to get to your questions during the question and answer session as time permits. And so to submit your questions, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your toolbar, right next to the interpretation icon I mentioned before, and you can type your questions and hit send. Let me begin our conversation today with a question for Ángela and Araceli. Before you joined the Caravan, each of you were involved in organizing committees of mothers in your countries. So can you tell us a little bit about the political organizing that you're involved with and the work that you've done to raise consciousness and demand justice for your children?
Bueno, buenas tardes.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Araceli de Mejia. I'm from El Salvador. I represent the Confamida Committee. We search for migrants who have disappeared or died from El Salvador. And our mothers on the committee are in that search. On our committee, we have a support of the committee and the steering committee, and many mothers have joined in this search. And I'm a representative of the subcommittee for searching the disappeared in there. We give notifications to the families when we find their remains, the remains of their family members. We give medical, psychological assistance, and we have invested in a lot of workshops thanks to cooperators who've been working with us. We've come in this caravan from Mexico in migrants, and we've found a DNA evidence, and we've been able to go to shelters, hospitals, and government entities, and we haven't gotten any response yet. We would also ask the consulates of our countries to support us in getting this information out about our committee, and we haven't had a response from them either. And this is our first time in the United States. We thank for cooperantes for the supporting us, and we hope to be able to get the response that we've been looking for. Since we've gone to these places, we've had the opportunity to meet with the human resources director, who put us in contact with Shared Martinez and the consulate of El Salvador, and my companions from Honduras and Guatemala as well. And we've made the requests and inquiries that we've wanted to do with this struggle of over 9 years. My son, Alexander Ramirez, has been disappeared for 9 years, and we've given all the information. And in this country and in our country, our home countries, and waiting for the response. We've shared DNA information from all our companions on the caravan, and we've done everything we can, and we would only hope in God that our petitions would be heard. And within the United States, we have a lot of support because we know that our children have disappeared in the US, in McAllen, Texas. The last call I received from my son was from McAllen, and being with Sheriff Martinez in McAllen, he showed us many, many files where there many remains. And it was so painful for us to think of the families that are waiting for that response. And this is a tireless struggle that we have to be able to give answers to each one of our families. And so that's why we're here in the US and asking for the authorities of the US to help us get those responses and get those remains with the DNA samples that we have. We went through the desert and our caravan, and with human rights and also distributing water so that those in the desert could drink water. But it's so difficult for us as mothers. We think everything our children suffered. It's not easy to see those files with so many remains. I don't know how many thousands of people have files like that. We are putting our best foot forward here in the US and having our voices be heard and hoping for responses. But many mothers, generations of them, hopefully will benefit from that little seed that we planted here. And with the consulate of El Salvador, we met with the consul, and we've filed lots of information with the government, and we've had zero information shared. And it's impossible that we as mothers could have this pain at the loss of our children and continue with this struggle without any response. We hope that we will be heard now and that our requests and petitions will be attended to, and that they'll do something to find our children so that we can take responses back to the committee and all those families who are waiting for those responses. And the authorities in the governments, including the US, to do something for us and for our children who have come looking for a better life, for work. Maybe they were escaping crime and extortions in our countries. And what did they find here? Death. It's impossible that this should continue. So please help us. We have rights as mothers, as human beings. Please respect them and help us to find them. To expand a little on what my companion said, our committee does basically the same thing. We look for partnerships and assistance, and sometimes mothers and family members of the disappeared don't realize that there's an organization in their country and they don't know how to come together to have support. In my case, it was very out of the ordinary. We're very Catholic, and I was listening to Catholic news, and I heard that there was going to be a meeting, a protest on the main avenue on the World Migrant Day, and I called the radio, and that's how I got the phone number for the person who was coordinating the committee. And from there, she immediately responded to my call and got me involved in the family committee, AMIFIB, for the disappeared. And there are many committees in El Progreso, and that's the strongest one because there are a lot of disappeared migrants there. And the committee is very big. They have attorneys, they have psychologists, and sometimes we get together with the committees in the southern portion since our country is very big. I know of 5 committees on the national level in our country where we try to come together and work with the partnerships with the Argentine anthropologists and the Red Cross and getting DNA samples, because in our countries, we don't have that assistance. In my case, I went to the Attorney General's office of our country to file a report, and in 5 years, I haven't gotten a response. So we haven't had any help from our governments. So we need to look for links to other organizations that can help us with these searches. We know that there are many mothers, because of time and pain, they don't join these organizations. They only pass on information. They're just members, but there could be thousands. And one of these organizations helped in the repatronization of the remains of a family members. Many of the family members are low income, and they're unable to have those remains shipped back to their country. And we can assist these family members. And sometimes the governments have helped with a percentage, but we need a national effort for this. Sometimes a family member needs to receive those remains. In our culture, we don't want a cremation. We don't want a box. Our Central American culture, we don't want those remains in ashes. We want the complete remains. And it's very difficult for a mother to be able to receive ashes. And who can help us with this? In some cases, people have been given animal ashes, and we've had tests done, and found that out. And this is very painful because in our culture, to be able to hold a proper burial and having the ashes of an animal, it's just an offense to us. But this is our struggle. We want to find our children alive, but even if we can find their remains and have them sent back to our countries, that's important for us. It's a difficult struggle because sometimes we have to go to places uh, that are far away, and we try to hold meetings, to involve mothers and follow up, because this affects the health of mothers, fathers whose child is missing, and their health deteriorates. There are cases of cancer, and we've had deaths with that desperation, waiting for news of their family member. It's not easy to have an organization like this and to be able to come together with other organizations and support these families. It's very difficult to find help, but we have trainings and we receive trainings as members, and if different subjects, psychological assistance, even help in seeing how to get a DNA sample from remains. But this is assistance for us to have that knowledge and to be able to demand a DNA sample that we can compare with different DNA banks and pools. And this is why we've had this caravan to plant the seed that we're hoping that it will grow everywhere that we've been. And like Araceli said, it's very important for all the remains that we've been able to find out about. That was a big impact, but this shows that we can demand more because there are remains and we don't know if the DNA samples they have there, if where they're from, if they can be compared to other DNA samples that the mothers have provided. And our vision is that we need to demand those DNA samples, and they can be compared from the DNA samples from the mothers. That's why we're here in the US, and so that we can ask where those DNA comparisons can be done of those remains. And for us, we've give DNA samples in different places in Mexico and Honduras through the Argentine anthropologists, and being here in Texas, they have our DNA samples. And if you could support us in this, it's not easy. This struggle isn't easy, but we're uniting more mothers. And if there's someone in the group that finds out that there's someone else has a family member missing, they invite them to join us, and we have a database of all the disappeared family members, and we're making partnerships with other brothers and sisters in Central America, Guatemala, Mexico, and we should have these partnerships because these partnerships help us to be united and do these searches. And there are commonalities that we can have between our countries and work together. Muchas gracias.
A lo largo de esto, usted se describió como
and as human rights defenders. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell us what are your demands and what would justice look like for you?
Well, more than anything, the petitions and then the opportunity that we get is a search, a field search, and because a lot of bodies in the desert that haven't been found, or they don't have the DNA testing, we were able to achieve to accompany Eddie Canales. He took us through a walkthrough in McAllen Desert where a lot of remains have been found, and the sand has covered them over, and it's just like very few remains of the body that are still there that they've been able to gather, and a lot of different thousands of different bodies that come from different parts of the world, not just Central America, but the whole world. I mean, we also ask that we get help to search in hospitals and rivers and pools, and that they will please give us the opportunity to do the work in the U.S. and families that can help us repatriate the remains, because sometimes they will notify us that the body is, but the repatriation, it's done like 5 or 6, 7 years later. That's not possible. That we have such a profound uh, ache and pain of the searching of our sons that it takes that long for the repatriation. That's even a bigger suffering that we have to go through and hardship. And on top of that, and beyond that, we would also request that they would give us the opportunity to be always here, be part of the caravans. And we ask all the countries with immigrants that we unite so that it is a strong front, because together we can achieve a lot of things. And also adding a little bit to what Araceli has been mentioning, we do want to have the ability that they have humanitarian visas so that more mothers can come and search like us. And God has blessed us, and we have visa, and we can come and do the search, and they can come and unite with us. But it's not just anybody that can come, and embassies, the U.S. embassies in our countries, you have to submit so many requirements and criteria. Not everybody can submit. So there's a cost even in order to request the visa, and they are expensive. And so humanitarian visas for the mothers that would have a desire to come and search so that they can be more connected to an organization. We know that it takes money, but we are taking these steps so that more groups will unite and fight with us, and also less militarization, and all our borders are militarized, not just Mexico, and also the border with the U.S. Each one of our borders, our countries receive money, and that money is invested in military, and all of it, they're not even military, they're just trained in their countries. How is it possible that the money that they receive, it's millions that they receive of their body, and they invest it to militarize borders? That's not possible. It's not possible. We want that to come to an end so that there's open borders. Here we are taking these steps so that borders are taken down so their voices can be heard. And we want that mainly and mostly that our fellow citizens, that if they come, that they will not be accosted by military and immigration agents that are influenced by the money sent by this and trained by the money that's sent to this country. And it's hard to think that a lot of our fellow citizens are killed by the military, on top of all of the different organized groups like this CETAs, but it's the military members on many occasions, because they have the training that they have received and the money from the government of the U.S. in order to be able to not allow for the immigration. And so we need assistance in that area so that there can be open border. We want open borders, that there are laws and reform in immigration law, that we have the right, because we have the desire to come. And if we have the desire to come to work, there's a lot of immigrants that come and they make money and they take it back to their countries. And now we want open borders, humanitarian visas for the vitalization. And that's 3 points that I would request. If there could be a lot of different other petitions, but I would focus in on those 3 that I think are very, very important.
Thank you. Gracias. Let me bring Suyapa and Jorge into this conversation. Suyapa, first, you've written about the root causes of migration, and your book, Roots of Resistance, extensively addresses the history of US capital and foreign intervention in Honduras. So can you tell us a bit about what your research reveals about the root causes of displacement and the factors that force migrants to leave their homes? Can you put these powerful stories that Angela and Araceli have told us into a bit of a regional context?
Thank you so much for having me. To the translators, I'm going to just speak in Spanish for 1 minute. Señora Ángela Lacayo y señora
So, Ms.
María
Angela
muchas gracias por estar aquí. Sus testimonios han sido muy poderosos. No solo porque están buscando justicia para su familia y miembros de su familia, pero por todos los inmigrantes. Y considero que es una lucha digna y honesta. En el 2006 tuve la oportunidad de estar con doña Rosanelli en Cofamipro. Y en esa época me acuerdo que todavía estaba empezando el Comité de las Madres en el Progreso Lloro y estaban vendiendo, ¿verdad?, enchiladas y cositas así para poder hacer el viaje a México a buscar por sus hijos, pero no había suficiente dinero para pasar de Chiapas. Entonces el hecho de que ustedes están acá es increíble, ¿no? Porque significa que hay mucho más apoyo por su lucha. En el 2018, doña Nelly me ayudó a repatriar el cuerpo de Roxana Hernández, una migrante trans que murió en un centro de detención en Nuevo México. Ella tenía VIH, no le dieron medicina, murió de golpes y deshidratación, no de VIH. Entonces su cuerpo fue repatriado a Honduras por medio de una organización que se llama Familia Trans Queer Liberation, y el cual yo lo recibí con doña Rosanelli para enterrarlo. Entonces, el trabajo que ustedes hacen es muy importante y muy valioso y quiero agradecerles por su lucha. I wanted to start by thanking the mothers. One thing I mentioned to them is that in 2006, when I was doing research on this book, I was in what is the Caribbean side of Honduras, the North Coast, where I was researching banana industry and taking oral histories of workers. And that's when I met Doña Rosanelli, who's one of the founders of COFAMIPRO committee, one of the committees that mentioned of the 5 committees in Honduras. And they were selling enchiladas and tacos to raise money to go to Mexico to look for their family members and to, engage. And they didn't have enough money at the time to go all the way to northern Mexico. They would stop at, Chiapas, because that's all the money they had at the time. So to see the mothers here is such an important moment, to see that there's more support for their struggle and to see that this is an important issue. In 2018, Doña Rosanelli actually helped me navigate the process to repatriate Roxana Hernandez, a trans immigrant who was basically killed in ICE detention in New Mexico. And Familia Trans Queer Liberation, an organization, a national organization of trans organization, actually led this effort. But I was in Honduras at the time doing research on my new project, and I was able to work with her to bring the body back and bury her and give her a dignified burial, which is so important, not just for Catholics or Christians, but in our culture, no matter what religion you are, what gender, what sexuality. It's so important for families to have closure. So their work is truly important. And actually, I think Kamala Harris should have met with these committees when she went to Guatemala, right? But we know she didn't. So I want to focus on 3 main points. And I just want to say, after a testimony like that, it's really hard to follow with an academic. I don't want to explain what the mother said. I don't want to, I'm going to add my voice to what they're very eloquently stated here today. I just want to talk about 3 things today to not take so much time. What do I mean by root causes and how my interpretation of root causes is different from the US State Department and RVP, right? And how the state has co-opted this notion of root causes, which really comes from the immigrant rights movement and from the left of the immigrant rights movement, just to be very clear. Not that there isn't, well, I'll talk some more about that. I want to talk about the coup d'etat in Honduras in 2009, and then I want to talk about the current migration movements and what it means for Central America and the US. So for my first point, what do I mean by root causes? When we say root causes of Central American migration, we really need to go back in history, right? About 200 years, maybe back to 1823, right? So about 200 years of capitalist extraction in places like Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, right? So I just wrote this book titled Roots of Resistance about worker resistance to the United Fruit Company and Thunder Fruit Company in the first half of the 20th century, where I outlined the various concessions, land, rivers, mountains, right, granted to US-owned companies to develop a booming banana industry. 100 years later, right, those companies have abandoned Honduran workers, sold the granted land back to the Honduran producers, and also sold land back to workers. Land that actually, like some of the areas for example, the area of Tacamiche and the area of San Juan, those areas flood. So actually they sold to workers to build colonias or neighborhoods, this land that floods, right? That was granted to them 100 years ago for nothing. So Honduran history is marked by extraction and US foreign domination of the economies, institutions, and even governments. And I think that that's really important to highlight here, right? So most immigration scholars will cite Hurricane Mitch as the beginning of the Honduran migration and the caravans, right? This is when the flood of people came. And I agree that natural disasters and climate change do have an incredible impact on migration and forcing people out, right? We saw Hurricane Eta and Iota, but I find that it's not as dire as the extraction of natural resources and raw materials, which have been occurring in Honduras since the 1800s, or Central America actually, because the economy impact of such extractive industries have cemented a model of capitalism that is extractive, right? And it's hard to shift this current model over time, right? It's been hard to shift, and particularly during this neoliberal era, even impossible. So we are seeing new models of extractivism. So the United Fruit Company already sold, Chiquita brands was sold to a Brazilian entity now, and the Standard Fruit Dole Corporation, have been sued for all kinds of things across the world, right? And their story has been revealed. But extractivism continues, and there's two particular ways I want to talk about that's happening. So displacement is being cemented, for example, by the approval of sedes by Honduran Congress and Juan Orlando regime. Sedes are called zones of development and employment, which really do not amount to jobs or development, nor a new model of development or exploitation. Rather, it's a model of dispossession, or despojo in Spanish, of ancestral lands, indigenous, Afro-indigenous lands of campesinos and campesinas. So basically, the Honduran government has said that it will sell lands for private cities with their own private security. So in some ways, that's not new. That's what the Banana Enclave was, a private city within a state, and within a nation state. So it's not very different from 100 years ago. Sedes are sort of for hire enclaves with the nation state. There's no respect for the sovereignty. There's no respect for the ILO Convention 169, which protects the indigenous rights of people to previous and informed consent before any form of development is imposed in the land in their territory. So it's interesting that I've been sort of studying the first half of the 20th century, late 1800s, and then we're seeing 100 years later with a new wave. Right, at that moment, there was a wave of liberalism, and now 100 years later, we're seeing a new wave of neoliberalism, which is really not very new, right? It's really recreating these models of inappropriate models, right? And then second, I want to say violence, right? And the persecution of those who protect their ancestral lands, rivers, indigenous and Afro-indigenous people. For example, the disappearance of 5 Garifuna youth in 2020 who were involved in the protection of, Garifuna land. the femicides of human rights defenders. The most famous case is Berta Cáceres, who was slain in 2016 for protecting the Hualcarque River. Violence is key to extractivist policies and governments and extractivist institutions, right? To capital, right? Capital can't function without violence. So we saw this in the early part of the 20th century with the banana companies, actually, and I document that in my book, right? The persecution of anybody that was not a Nationalist Party member. Interesting, right? So, and basically the complicity of these companies, the US State Department, with military police and death squads, threats of rape and torture. I mean, I document some of that in the book, right? The persecution of Hondurans who wanted to have a labor movement, right? Who wanted to have labor protections. And so we're seeing a resurgence of this in Honduras with the Juan Orlando Hernandez regime. In fact, during the bicentenary celebration in September 15th of 2021, Juan Orlando said that LGBT activists, reproductive rights organizers, and land and water and human rights defenders were, and I quote, the enemies of independence. So he's setting up a dichotomy reminiscent of the Cold War years. So the only way that he's able to stay in power, right, and the only way he can guarantee American corporations, but not just American corporations, we're thinking Korean, Chinese corporations who do business in Honduras, is through this, through violence and militarization, as Doña Angela Lacayo had said very eloquently, right? The way the regime stays in power is through US dollars that are given for quote unquote security, which goes through military police and, you know, other entities that were created right after the coup d'etat, which I'll talk about in a moment. Control and domination of society, right? Again, we saw throughout history how that worked during the banana regime, right? We also saw post 1963 and the coup d'etat of that period, which brought about 30 years of military dictatorship, military juntas, which was pacted sort of in the 1980s. There was a pact to get rid of the military juntas, and they brought some of the most conservative elements of the Liberal Party, Roberto Suazo Cordova, who ended up becoming a Cold War warrior as well, right? 2,000 students were disappeared, right? So this is a history most people don't know about Honduras, right? Most of the history tends to focus on El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the wars, but there was definitely a resistance movement in Honduras that was quenched, totally destroyed, right, by the Cold Warriors, and this is where many of the operations against Salvadorans and the FMLN and the FSLN at the period came from, right? Honduras was utilized as an airport for the United States to keep the region in check, but Hondurans were also engaged in resistance movement. It's important to remember that as you see the disappeared and sort of the disappearances and sort of the activists emerged post 2009 coup. In January of 2021, to enshrine, they enshrined in the Constitution that reproductive rights, gay rights, and marriage equality was prohibited. So every year, Juan Orlando Hernandez and the Nationalist Party since the coup d'etat has promoted a distance from human rights, against total annihilation of human rights, constitutional law. In fact, the Inter-American Court just ruled in June of 2021 that Honduras does not protect transgender rights in the case of Vicky Hernandez, which I was so privileged to be part of. So Honduras is a killer state, but it has had plenty of help from the US capitalist corporations, such as United Fruit Company, and then, the Maquila corporations now, the US State Department and the US Embassy. We must not forget this history because these players are still in the picture and are still influential in Honduran elections, for example, in 2013 and 2017, most clearly, and still provide support to corrupt Nationalist Party and have condoned death and destruction, right? And funding Juan Orlando Hernandez mean funding death squads, disappearances, military police, which were sort of erected in 2014 and had not existed since the Cold War era of the 1990s. So when Vice President Kamala Harris visits Guatemala and tells Central Americans to not come and reveals her plan for addressing root causes by bringing corporations such as Nestle, I see another extractivist venture that will not bring development. So that, you know, the idea that what people need is just these corporations extracting so that they can provide wages, by the way, wages that don't respect the national labor law, wages that are sub labor law. No, you know, people can't even organize in these when they work for these corporations. This is why you know, the unions that existed from the banana region were so important as well. So I really believe that Hondurans have the capacity to build their justice sovereignty, to change their own destiny, and can do it, right? So the success of the banana workers in the strike it was a powerful reference, you know, a point of what is possible with organized resistance. But but then what about today, right? With these US diplomatic missions, covert actions, it kind of remains to be seen, right? Will the United States respect the election results in 2020? Will the United States continue to fund Juan Orlando Hernández and his party, which have proven to have connections to narco trafficking? I want to turn now really quickly, and I'm almost done, to the coup d'etat in 2009. There's been many coups in Honduras. If you know Honduran history, there's been many coups, right? I don't know, like 70 or something like that. I think at one point we counted. And coups sometimes are violent and sometimes means, you know, going from one junta to another military junta, right? So sometimes it's even the military at some point in the 60s and 70s trading, right, power. But 2009 was the most egregious destruction of the rule of law, the Constitution, and the thin democracy that existed in Honduras, and it was executed by Hillary Clinton during the Obama administration. It revealed to us sort of intellectuals and thinkers that, you know, the Cold War thinkers and actors with power are still in the State Department, right? That the right wing in Latin America, many trained in the US, as La Compañera said, right, Angela, you know, those people trained in the US are still in power in Honduras, right? So that there's this interesting allegiance between the right there and the right here. The coup also reveals how little Honduras matters to the US public and taxpayers. I think the death of Michael Jackson sort of eclipsed the coup news. And I know that because I was doing press almost every day. So, you know, it was also the time of Obamacare, and people were negotiating and haggling to pass Obamacare. So Hondurans were very low on that totem pole there, right? Despite all of our efforts to talk to Congress people about this. For us Hondurans, scholars, and everyday citizens alike, this was the most profound act of violence in the 21st century. It changed everything, and Hondurans are not the same. And so I think what the coup does is it raises a resistance movement that didn't exist in Honduras, perhaps since 1954, where my story takes place, you know, and that's really important and transformative. And we'll see how every year, you know, it's not just about the formation of a political party, Libre, right? Libertad y Refundación. It's also about the formation of a social movement. It's also about the formation of a social movement that can articulate in different ways climate change, talk about environmental differences, and talk about human rights, or talk about LGBT and trans rights, and also talk about reproductive rights, right? So you're seeing this very interesting emergence of a resistance movement to this violence, right? So I want people to leave here thinking, ay que pobrecitos, or poor Hondurans. I want people to see these people are fighting as hard as they can, and how can we support them? And how does the current migration movement, just to end what I've tried to encapsulate here, you know, when we think of immigrants at the border organizing for TPS or DACA, we need to think about that we can no longer think, legislate, study migration from a domestic point of view. We must look at the global impact, the transnational connections, and we must push for a holistic approach to immigration. And what does that mean? Not a holistic approach to immigration for the safety of human life. What does that mean? One, working with developing nations on one-sided efforts. You know, not working with developing nations on one-sided efforts, right? Like introducing corporations like Nestle or Microsoft. That's not useful. We must respect their sovereignty and not support governments linked to narco traffickers such as Juan Orlando Hernández, and promote for election results that are respected, right? We're no longer in the 1920s when the US State Department and the US Embassy could tell Hondurans what party needed to be in place, right? We're in a place where we need to believe that Hondurans have the opportunity and the right to choose their own destiny and to choose their own government and to govern themselves, right? So respecting human life is more than telling people not to come. To me, this includes granting asylum, removing Title 42 as a bar to asylum, not detaining children and trans people, in these cold cells where they get sick and die, not detaining them for years. I've met trans women who were detained for 5, 6, 7 years. Can you imagine that in an immigration detention center, right? Removing the consequences, removing the felony charges, right, for crossing the border. This is not a crime. And also granting TPS and DACA recipients legal permanent residence after years of proving essential labor for our economy here, improving family reunification and moving the backlog. To me, that domestic agenda has to be linked as well to what's happening back home in these countries. So what opportunities do we see here, for working together? One, Latina solidarity with Black migrants, unity in the immigration movement, as la compañera Maria Araceli said, right? We need unity because, what I saw with those horrible images in Texas of Haitian immigrants being lashed by Border Patrol, and to hear a silence in the Latina-led immigration movement is shocking and devastating, and it doesn't help our movement. We need trans solidarity in the immigration movement and reforms. I've been part of a committee for almost 10 years. We organized I'm a co-founder of the Mayday Trans Queer contingent in Los Angeles, and the idea was to bring sort of trans issues to the immigration front and also to challenge the white-led gay movement to understand immigration and to build solidarity. And one of the things we saw was resistance, an ability to engage and build together. And so again, no unity means no change, right? When we leave our countries, we just don't forget them, the people we leave behind, our families and friends. And so, we carry them with us. We send remittances. In fact, the number one GDP, the GDP in Honduras is 100% reliant on remittances for immigrants. So Honduras is no longer exporting bananas and coffee, but we're exporting immigrants. So this is serious, and I feel like our legislators need to understand this as well on all sides, both sides of the border. I want to close today with, again, recognizing the mothers for the sustained resistance bill over time, which I also feel is very linked to our histories in Central America of resistance and movements such as the banana workers. And those patronas and those women cooks, right? I mean, when I saw mothers selling food just to make a bus trip to Mexico to find their loved ones, I knew they had a really powerful story, and I'm really glad to be in this panel today with them. I'm going to close there, and hopefully we'll have more of a discussion in the question and answer period.
Thank you, Suyapa. That's a great segue for me to bring Jorge in. Jorge, the Caravan of Mothers is a movement of directly affected people taking action, telling their own stories. And this really resonates with your work in the context of El Salvador on how people create life among what, in the midst of what seems to be predestined death. And so can you tell us a bit about what you've learned in the course of your work on how Central Americans are making life amidst the strategic abandonment of the neoliberal state?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to echo everything that Suyapa said and also extend my gratitude to the organizers and to Las Madres por estar con nosotros, and thank you very much for that. Del Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano, Migrant Roots Media, and Pax Christi USA, who were instrumental in putting this together. So what I have studied in El Salvador is a kind of contemporary phenomenon of disappeared peoples within the country. We're talking right now by migrants who go disappeared, but this is a phenomenon that takes place within our countries themselves through extrajudicial violence, through gang violence, through even petty crime and domestic violence. And these are, I think, for me at least, an important place to understand how sort of disappearance as a phenomenon has gripped the societies of Central America. And here, what the work of different groups, some of which are in part of an organization like Cofamide, but are also marshaling community projects in order to get the state to help them locate their disappeared family members, is something that for me has been an interesting way to think about how the la búsqueda, or looking for disappeared people, in fact indicts an entire state and transnational state system that's diabolic in nature, and that really is a machine that eats through what are considered to be surplus populations that are poor, marginalized groups that often live in very kind of precarious situations. So I guess what I tend to do in my work is look at how El Salvador, as a case study example of Central America, has been created through an elite model of accumulation, and that has used punitive responses to shape that society and to discipline it. This we call neoliberalism as a shorthand. And what this has done, it has worn away the region's life supports and the life sustaining qualities that allow people to live dignified lives in Central America. And this is due to US imperialism, as my colleague Suyapa mentioned, but it also has created mass uncertainty and insecurity that I think, for me, has created a crisis of life itself. It has criminalized social reproduction and has made it really a crime to persist and endure in these hostile terrains. These are suffocated environments. El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, they're suffocated environments that have pushed people to do this kind of work of locating their disappeared, of entering into agroecological projects, or even kind of educative arrangements to teach each other how to live and understand the reality that they're enmeshed in order to seek justice. And I think this idea of seeking justice is to me, is a kind of politics that is transformative, in that it reveals the depth at which the social fabric itself has been torn apart. And this, of course, is due to things like CAFTA, to the militarization of policing and the militarization of everyday life, through the economic contraction of people not being able to find employment, to find dignified work. And this has created mass misery that compels people first to move from their rural hamlets that they live in into cities that also have nothing to offer them, and pushes them outward into the transnational corridor towards the United States, and also increasingly southward to places like Panama and Colombia. So my work really is trying to understand how regular folks are mobilizing these kind of minoritarian politics, like looking for a loved one, and how that actually is evidence of a decayed social and political environment that has been long in the making by elite interests and by capital, that has forced folks to enter into looking for their disappeared in a place like El Salvador as a matter of necessity, as a matter of hope, as a matter of community restoration, and making whole their sense of family. And I think this is what the madres have spoken to eloquently, that it is that driving aspect of it that is emotion filled and powerfully kind of prefigurative, that helps us to imagine a restored society and restored life world that looks much different than the neoliberal everyday that we have had for the last 40 years. So I think that some of the work that I look at is specifically with the work of forensic criminologists. So the Argentine team is an example that I take very seriously as offering a lot of help to folks who are looking for their disappeared, but also other kinds of social actors, like from the Attorney General's office in El Salvador. There's a figure in there, his name is Israel Ticas, who is this forensic criminologist who helps folks locate their disappeared. And he's one person helping most of the country look for folks who are disappeared. And here, like, you can see that not only is something like the question of finding and locating bodies not a priority in any government agenda, but it shows in the kind of practice of forensic criminology by this figure Ticas, where he's actually the one fielding many of the requests and really the pleas of mothers and loved ones that are trying to locate the person who has disappeared by, you know, the myriad things that are afflicting Salvadoran society. And this is, again, like a way that the work of locating the disappeared is going to fill in many of the gaps that have been created by, you know, a collapsed and fractured society. And this idea of looking towards these groups who are marshaling these claims on the state, it's showing how the state is complicit in processes of corruption and impunity, and themselves, you know, part of the mechanisms that disappear people from society, and that create these holes of loss that folks are now trying to restore and repair and put back together. So in some kind of my work is about taking seriously the meanings of local Salvadorans in pursuit of justice and dignified ways of life. Through everyday activities such as this. It's become an everyday activity because of the generalization of insecurity and the phenomenon of disappeared folks, in order to incubate a better El Salvador that deliberately unlinks from the seductions of neoliberalism, where the idea of losing a loved one, it becomes a personal problem, and individualistic response is required in order to, you know, find your loved one. But as we can see today, this phenomenon has become so big that it's become not only transnational in nature, but folks are finding one another and creating community around loss, around hopelessness. And to me, that incubates a kind of politics that indicts this entire, you know, homicidal ecology, and points us in a different direction. So just to give one example, I was part of a búsqueda for locating a disappeared person in Usulutan in El Salvador. And here, like, there was the person they were looking for was no one that seemed to be significant. It was a local drunk, that somebody that had gone disappeared for a couple of years. And you can see how in the act of recovery, when we went to Usulutan, folks would come out and show up and participate. They would you know, be talking to the various firefighters who were there and the criminologists, and to me, of course. And they also understood and assimilated this reality that was unfolding around them as a kind of performance of restoring a fractured community, one that had been fractured by gangs, by domestic violence, by petty crime, by you know, agrarian reductions that have also affected, you know, reproduction itself, and the acquisition of food, for example. And so here, like, there's a almost, I want to call it a kind of tradition, it seems now, that from the 1980s civil wars into the present, where you have exhumation and bringing bodies to the surface in order to give them a dignified burial, as a kind of process of restoration, and of retelling, you know, the contemporary history of a place like El Salvador, not from, you know, the machinations of the state and all of this, but actually from place-based needs, that I think that really tell us that give us a different vantage point as to how the crisis that we constantly talk about, the crisis of migration, the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of humanity, is really hitting the ground, very literally and figuratively, in El Salvador as a question of mass disappearance. And so here I actually track how criminology, and forensic criminology specifically, has transitioned from the 1980s into the present as a kind of tool, right, for not only as a political tool for indicting a political system that, you know, has created wanton disaster and violence across so many sectors. And this is like the work of the Argentine forensics that were mentioned earlier, but then how those tools become recast in a post-war contemporary moment with a different kind of applicability that was unforeseen from the 1980s. And so here, like forensic criminology becomes a kind of psychosocial instrument to making communities livable once again, for things like spiritual closure that I think was also mentioned by the madres. And so, you know, these are the kinds of things that my work tries to attend to, of how there's a project, and a diffuse project. Sometimes it's organized, sometimes it's just community oriented, sometimes it's very familial, but there's a project in order to mend a very broken social fabric, and it's very kind of punctuated and very visible in the crisis of disappeared peoples by gangs or by extrajudicial violence and things like this. But again, like behind all of this, it's that same backdrop that Suyapa so beautifully narrated, of neoliberalism in Central America, of climate disaster, of infrastructural deficiencies, of free trade, right? It's all of these same symptoms and morbid symptoms, we might call them, things like the coup d'etat and political crisis, right, in Honduras, in El Salvador. We have one 10 years later with someone like Nayib Bukele. You know, there's kind of a repetition into the symptoms that have really maligned Central American societies, and that are fueling these dynamics of expulsion to other parts of the world. But the criminalization of social reproduction itself, it starts in Central America, right? It starts in Central America, and it's something that has also become a kind of device in order to criminalize folks before they even leave Central America, before they even think about migrating elsewhere. And again, this is all sustained by that same backdrop of corruption and impunity that we see in other countries as well, but in El Salvador, increasingly so, where the priorities have always been to feed the interest of an elite group of people who we often refer to in El Salvador as the oligarchy, la oligarquía. And I think that's something that also repeats itself throughout Central America, in order to pillage the country for its natural resources, to sell it off to transnationals and multinational investors. Today, we see that with Bitcoin, for example, as this kind of ploy that really evidences this kind of schizophrenic thinking by the Salvadoran state, where you have value in Bitcoin being privileged over value of water, right? So you have this kind of contestation over the notion of value too, and life itself as reproductive capacity in a place like El Salvador, where you see the state's interest being in this fictitious and immaterial source of value. And we are having the privatization of water, you're having the reduction of arable land, and no agrarian reform on the agenda, you know, and also the expansion of economic opportunity as actually really just opening up more spots in the police and the military, and this being the kind of vehicle for social development and the integrating of marginalized community or historically marginalized communities to actually have dignified employment. But if that option is only maquiladoras or the military or the police, you can see right there the actual investments of the US state and of Central American states and the Salvadoran state into reproducing politics as usual. So I'll stop there, but I'm looking forward to the conversation. And again, thank you for this space.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Suyapa, for this invaluable context. Hopefully we can get everyone sort of talking together in a moment, but I wanted to just turn to a couple of the questions that have been submitted from the audience. They're both submitted in Spanish, so I'll just translate them out loud for the English-speaking audience, and then I'll read them in Spanish. So the first question, which follows directly on what Jorge was discussing, was a reference to the forensic anthropology team from Argentina, and how does the forensic anthropology team from Argentina assist the madres in their struggle, in their work for justice for their children and for their families. So a very specific question there. Entonces, la pregunta es para las madres y la pregunta es, ¿cómo ayuda el equipo de antropología forense de Argentina en su lucha y reivindicación de justicia para sus hijos y sus familias? Entonces, tenemos una pregunta aquí para ustedes sobre los forenses argentinos y la colaboración que sus organizaciones han tenido con ellos.
Bueno, en el comité por familia del
So in the committee in El Salvador, a lot of mothers have undergone DNA tests through the Argentine anthropologists, and most of them have been done with mothers within the committee, have been carried out through the DNA testing. Those have already been done, yes. And the same in Honduras, all of the mothers that are integrated into the committee, they have done the DNA testing on us. And initially in the committee, there is a teaching and a training that explains to the mothers what the process is going to be. And even before that, the visits and requesting for to the, who are the main family members that will be tested, because it's 2 or 3 members of the family that are the more direct ones, so that the DNA that is acquired is the most exact in order to be able to add it to the DNA bank. And we receive a training before they do the DNA testing and take the samples that will be integrated, and what the process will be like, that we need to sign, and we need to be aware and informed of what we're doing, that we're not forced into doing, but that all the mothers and members are not under obligation of doing it, what the process will be, what the objectives are and the goals, so that they will have all of the information, right? So exactly what it's for and what it will be used. Well, mostly, obviously, alive, which is what we've been talking about, because they came alive. We want them back alive, but we also need to do the search with these DNA tests and samples, because there's a lot of clandestine forces. And the Argentine anthropologists will explain to us that they create a bank of fingerprints as well, that they also, with other organizations, they create links in order to be able to test them and evaluate them, and assessed by Mexico, for instance, and even the US, I would imagine, with all of the different border areas, they undergo that process. It's not really done that often. We have to have a group, and it's a process, the training and explaining, and the days that they arrive to the events, that everything has to be done the way that they explain it. And the taking of the samples and the blood samples, and the anthropologists will do it through blood. I mean, it was interesting to me that when they did the Texas and McAllen in Falfurrias, they did the test through saliva. And the sample, and that was my question, and because sometimes I'm a little nosy, and which one's the most exact one, and apparently it's saliva that's more exact, but the anthropologists will use blood, and they will have their methods, of course, of how to be able to evaluate those and assess them, and add them to the banks that they have in the storage. And it's important that mothers are able to have these samples through this organization, that if they will provide this aid, because it's an aid, and we know that they have their teams and their crews, and in order to add these to our countries, and it can add a cost, right? But it would be important that all of the family members of somebody that's disappeared can be done, and can have the DNA and have the sample, so that at any given moment it might be used and needed, and it can be sent at a moment's notice to maybe they have new samples in order to do new comps. And yes.
Muchas gracias. Y tengo otra pregunta Para ustedes viene de Alemania, entonces voy a leer la pregunta en español primero, luego para la gente que está escuchando en inglés y luego volvemos. Entonces la pregunta es, gracias por su incansable lucha y mi solidaridad desde Alemania. Me gustaría saber hasta qué punto el tener una alianza y un acompañamiento con otras madres le ha ayudado en su proceso de búsqueda. Esto les ha devuelto alguna forma de esperanza. Entonces, la pregunta es sobre como el impacto, el papel de la solidaridad con otras madres. So we have a question from Germany that is asking the mothers how it has been helpful for them to work in alliance with other groups and to receive the accompaniment of other mothers who are in similar situations, how that's helped them in their process of searching for their disappeared loved ones, and whether or not those collaborations have given them any form of hope. Entonces, la pregunta es para ustedes.
Bueno, la lucha que tenemos nosotros como madres.
Well, the battle that we have as mothers and between our mothers as we support each other, because we know that the only one that shares the pain as us can really truly comprehend us, because sometimes not even acquaintances and family will understand really what we have to deal with inside, and it's our kids and those that have a loved one that's disappeared can truly be able to understand this tireless effort and fight and battle that we will do until we find them. And sometimes mothers, they just cannot even barely talk and get through it. I mean, I was one of them that at the very beginning, I could barely say anything. I'm crying, but now I've gotten that fortitude by God. And it's been 9 years since I lost my son, but I have the fortitude and faith in God that someday I will find them. And that way we support the moms that are just initiating in this on this road. It's not easy, and they just start in this fight, tireless fight, and we support them in all aspects, and we support them psychologically with their illnesses, because all of us moms will come up with a disease through this journey. And just the fact that we're looking, I mean, it brings us a pride, and we're wondering where they're at, what happened to them, where they're at. I mean, it just eats away at us, and to see all of those files and the storage and of bodies, that we feel that our kids might be there. And so it's really hard. And we hope that after all the DNA testing that we left, and then the ones that we have left in years past, that we'll be able to find our kids and join all of those mothers that are searching their loved ones, that for them, and fight, because one day we will find them. That we're leaving all of these signs along the way, and this caravan, so that they will find their kids someday as well, and that maybe our governments will speed up the paperwork in order to be able to find them, because they have all of the ability to do it. They have all of the weapons and the tools to be able to find them. And we are doing all of the work that belongs to the government. I mean, how is this possible that they leave us and not pay attention to us and listen to us? They need to understand that we are mothers and that our fight, that it better be worth it. And talking a little bit about what Araceli was saying, some of these organizations, committees that we are a part of and fighting through, they help us honestly to be able to get things off of our chest. And at home we can't cry sometimes, and we are putting things away in our hearts, and we cry maybe at night, that nobody can see us in the family, that we're crying, that we're carrying that pain, because we have to keep moving forward, right? And so these organizations will help us. They listen to us, and they listen to each one of the moms and see their pain, and that they can freely speak and share about their situations, and even be just express solidarity, give us a hug, and even just a hug is enough and your heart takes courage when that happens, and it's not easy. In my case, for instance, my son left 4 kids. 3 of them are with me. I can't barely even talk about this at home. I can't talk about this at home. It's prohibited. It's not allowed, the subject, and they don't know that their father disappeared, even though this his son is 5. They think that he's working, but they still ask. It's not easy for me to talk about this subject, and I have put up this barrier at home. I put up this wall of not talking about this because it's not easy. I go to these organizations to take things off of my chest, to talk, to unload, to express the pain and unload the pain so I can share it with other moms and listen to others. And the pain of others is my pain, and my pain belongs to them as well. And we will strengthen each other. It's not easy, but fighting has to be constant, and faith and hope is what keeps us going and sustains us. It's not easy. The pain is forever present. It's a wound that doesn't heal. It doesn't heal. It will heal when we know and have news of our sons and we find them. And personally, there's still a lot of moms and family members that don't join an organization because of fear, because they're going to ask them for money, because they think that they're going to be extorted. And these organizations, I mean, you try to be the most the not to be solidarian, and to not and to guide them, and for them not to be giving their emails and their phone numbers, because that makes it so that they are extorted. And with the having the news and the hope, and on the other side of, I'll have your son here, you have to give this amount of money, and you move heaven and earth and be extorted. So these organizations help you to guide us as mothers, and for us to not be objects of extortion. And maybe we have been extorted at one point in time, and because of the joy that maybe there's some good news on the other side, and the joy of knowing that maybe somebody will be doing something for our family, and maybe it's an extortion, and you're even left worse off. And so these organizations, they do help. I can say that yes, they do help. And if there's a need, a psychological need, there's a need, if there is a health need, you look for the way, and to see through what organization you can find some help for medication for maybe the mother that, because of the loss of the family member, their son now suffers from cancer, or they've developed cancer, or arterial high blood pressure, and sometimes even stress. There are so many illnesses that come up after a loss. Only one knows this, that but that mother that asked, and if I would say, if you have a family member and you know of an organization, you get close to them. You will find help and solidarity, a hug of saying, we're together in this, mothers together. We will never be and God with us, and no one will ever come against us, and that God is the only one that will fill our hearts and will give us that strength. And it's not easy. It's not easy to know that you have a heart that's injured, and waiting for an answer is not easy. But mothers, we know we give each other our strength together, because we share the pain, and we feel the same, and we're in the same fight, and that makes it so that we can be stronger, so that they can see us stronger, than we will fight until we find them, because we want them alive, and we seek them because we love them. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Ni puedo imaginar todo lo que están viviendo en estos momentos tan duros, todo lo pesado de esto. Y les damos toda nuestra solidaridad. Muchas gracias por sus palabras. I am thanking the mothers for their testimonies and saying that I can't even imagine what it is that they've lived through, and that their solidarity and their strength and their struggle are so powerful and such a source of um, inspiration and really amazement. I don't think anyone who who hasn't lived this experience themselves directly can really understand exactly what it means. But we're so grateful that the mothers have shared their testimony with us. I am just going to invite the mothers, if they have any last word or thought they want to leave us with. We have to close the event very soon, but I'm just going to ask them if they have anything else they'd like to leave us with, and that will be the final question. So, a las madres, porque vamos cerrando el evento, solo les quería
Bueno,
preguntar
decirles
si
les
ustedes tienen
agradecemos este espacio.
alguna otra palabra, alguna cosa para cerrar, otra cosa que quiere decir a nosotros, que quieren que nosotros conozcamos, comprendamos, si tienen alguna idea de lo que se puede hacer desde aquí en Estados Unidos para
If you have any idea of what we can do here in the US to pressure our authorities to do something, last words that you'd like to share with us, please. We'd love to hear from you. Well, I'd like to, through you, tell the authorities that we've made aware of the situation, our petitions, and who have heard us. And as mothers, this is the first time we've been able to do this in the US. Please, may this not fall on deaf ears. And the future of our finding our children depends on this. And for all those families who have a disappeared family member in Central America, in the US, anywhere in the world, contact an organization so that your children can be found. First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving us this opportunity, and I want the whole world to know through you the pain that a mother suffers, that we're crossing borders, that we're not going to stop fighting for the search for our children, for our family members from Central America. If you have within your reach to lift that voice up to other organizations, and that those voices may not remain silent, but may be heard, and that our petitions, our searches may be fruitful. We want to be a country, a world that's better than we have right now. And may the borders open and the world have more hope, and that there may be solidarity in each person, and that hearts be opened to migrants. Let's have solidarity and union, and so that we can achieve all of our.
Many thanks to Suyapa and Jorge for putting these powerful testimonies in historical and political context. I wish we had more time to speak, but I'm so grateful to all of those of you who were able to join us via the webinar. And I'm so grateful to the Mahindra Center and all of the organizers of this event, and Barbara Sostaita in particular, for making it possible to share the message of the Madres more widely, to distribute information about what they're going through, to make everyone more aware of the crimes that are being committed in our name by the death machine that is the contemporary US border system. So thank you all for your time today. Muchísimas gracias a las madres. And I hope that their powerful message stays with you, and that you carry it with you as you go throughout the rest of your day, and indeed the rest of your life. No? Entonces, muchísimas gracias a todos. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you to Mahindra. We're going to be ending the webinar now. Goodbye. Adios.